Welcome to Olympian Method. I'm Sean.
And I'm Wolf.
This is a philosophy show where we ask the big questions.
And we provide the answers, but then we doubt those answers.
We doubt the answers, and we need your help. So please comment down below. Let us know what you think. Engage in philosophy with us. We'd love to know what you think.
Indeed.
We really would. All right, Wolf, I'm going to go to our text thread to try and wrap things up a little bit.
Yeah, the source of all great knowledge.
The source of all great knowledge, the text thread. So I said to you essentially that I feel like I understand why this is such a difficult topic, because postmodernism, or this, we'll call it this reckless skepticism, or just the ad infinitum skepticism, causes you to encounter an existential crisis of how little you actually know. Yeah,
and we sort of talked about that in the previous episode where we did a lot of talking about perception, skepticism, and those types of things, and went over sort of some of the potential logical conclusions of that extreme form of skepticism already.
Right. And I mean, are we in agreement that this can kind of dovetail with nihilism if taken to an extreme, like that vacuum leads to an absence of value?
It can. I don't want to ever say that it has to, because that's giving up too much ground there.
It is giving up too much ground. So what are the redeeming qualities of postmodernism, do you think?
So I think we've sort of agreed that we have the skepticism towards the meta narratives, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've talked a little bit about some of the potential limitations that we live under because of those meta narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's been, let's say, abuse of some of the meta narratives. And I think this is not just true of the Enlightenment. I know it was kind of a reaction to Enlightenment, but the same thing is true of previous narratives, like the more religious approaches, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think in some ways this is kind of a more comprehensive framework for challenging the status quo, as it were.
Right. It's almost an idea about rebellion in a sense.
In a sense, yeah. And I think it's, you were talking about this a little bit off camera or off offline or whatever, about how providing that counterpoint maybe helps us actually develop more well thought out approaches by being able to respond to criticism of what, I think you and I are both fairly Enlightenment minded in terms of our thought processes.
I think we both strive for it, for sure.
Yeah.
We definitely both I hope we do. I hope you do too. But yeah, you said, taken to the extremes, we have very little or no room to progress for progress, right?
Right.
So obviously cowardliness, if you're not skeptical about anything, then you're just basically a vessel for whatever the dogma of the society that you're in gives. So
you're just taking in the narrative as it's being fed to you. You're like a Clockwork Orange with your eyes just forced open, and you're just having to take it all in, and you're accepting that, and that's what you think.
Right. And by the way, in a tyrannical system, that would be forced upon you, and you wouldn't even have the option of performing skepticism. You wouldn't be able even to practice skepticism.
Well, see,
right?
I want to disagree with that slightly, because I think that you would be forbidden from expressing skepticism. But I think that, and this goes back to Stoic philosophy, I think the one thing we do have control over, though, is our own thoughts. We can still be thinking critically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, but I think there's a problem there if we're not able to express that openly, if we're not able to have dialogues or exchanges with other people. That would necessarily limit how much ideas would spread or develop, or, in the Enlightenment sense, they would, work together collectively to improve the system. So, yeah, I think it would hinder progress to a certain degree, but I don't think it would prevent skepticism or that type of thought process within the individual, if that makes sense.
Right. And not to keep circling back to the root note of the conversation, which I really think is actually freedom of speech. If it wasn't for the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, these postmodern ideas that question overarching meta narratives might not even have been allowed to come to fruition, right?
Right.
Or to be expressed. They could have been suppressed. Like in some areas that does happen, actually.
Yeah, but I agree with that, but I don't think that for that reason that we should necessarily rule out all of the postmodernist thought, because I think that what I was just getting at is that there's always value to challenging if we can be doing things better. So there, along that spectrum of skepticism, there's always going to be a healthy amount of it. And I think that there are some within the community that ascribe themselves as being postmodernist, or at least like to think in that way, that are applying a healthy amount of skepticism. And it gets into a dangerous, or it gets into a difficult situation of how do you decide what's the right application of that?
Exactly. And I kind of mentioned off camera that I wanted to kind of talk about economics a little bit, and I'm very poorly informed on economic theory, like actual doctrine, but it seems to me that, culture is upstream from politics, but then economics is upstream from culture. And so and economics is a social science, right? So how does postmodernism, say, influence economics? Like to be skeptical of economic systems, I think we can all argue is a good thing, but obviously you don't want to just completely tear down everything about an economic system and then try to build it from the ground back up. You don't have to reinvent the wheel necessarily, right?
Right. And I think this is also like, so I think with any system where you want to be skeptical and critical and challenge the status quo, like I was saying, I think it's better to you need to come up with a way of making progress by sort of evolving and working within the system that you're in. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are certain aspects of economics that are sort of just ingrained in us, in a lot of different ways with regards to things like fairness and value and all that sort of, labor and all those sorts of things.
Justice too. Even.
Justice and all those sorts of things. Yeah. So I think that you can't just forget all that and somehow start from scratch in some sort of utopian society. So that just seems like pointless to me, but I think that there's still room to question where there is unfairness and fraud and all these other things going on within your system. Like, yeah, you need to be able to be skeptical of those things, but again, it's like, what's the right amount of skepticism to apply?
That's right. And to read your text, perhaps we should warn our audience against taking things too far, while acknowledging that there's a healthy amount of skepticism to have. Basically, what you just said.
Basically, just my own thoughts read back to me.
But I think the way to navigate this is, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but also don't just blindly accept what everyone is telling you, right? I mean, we obviously live in a day and age where we have phones, we've got podcasts to listen to, we have all of these distractions that are sort of feeding us information, and we're trying to make a decision about whether this information is actually good for us, right? Like we make these little discriminatory decisions about what it is that we like, what it is that we don't like, and I mean discrimination loosely, but it's the question of what will make our lives better, so to speak, and allowing the dialogue to ask that question.
And how do we even decide what is the better life, right?
How do you make that value judgment, right?
Right. I mean, like where do we aim for, right?
You mentioned that you might want to talk about moral relativism. Do you think like postmodernism kind of allows for that?
I think it does. But I don't think that's necessarily like an irredeemable quality of it either, because I think that there's a couple different flavors of relativism here, and even subjectivism too, which is like kind of wrapped up in the same school of thought. Because I think to take a step back, I think it's possible to because one potential approach is sort of the Socratic, all I know is that I know nothing.
Right.
Like that's the one reaction, and that's like, yeah, I mean that what does that tell you? Like that. It's good to challenge the degree to which you know things, but what I would say is there's like a softer form of that I more personally subscribe to, which is just that there's less certainty with the things that I know. And so what I mean by that, so I'm going to come back to the moral relativism in a second here. So what that means is that the approach that I'm taking is basically opening up the room for sort of doubting, and this is a very Cartesian approach, where there's a certainty in my head with regards to the knowledge I have, but there's also a willingness to accept more knowledge that I don't yet have, if that makes sense. So,
right. So fill your cup up, but don't fill it up all the way.
Something like that. So back to the moral question here. So what I think we can say here is that it comes down to like we want to believe there can be moral progress, that that some systems of morals or some systems of ethics lead to better outcomes than others, right?
Yes.
And so I think that any extreme form of moral relativism kind of throws that away, and that's what I want to get away from. But there's a less extreme form of moral relativism, which is more of that you have to build the system within the constraints of sort of the society and the social structures that you have. So you can point toward a potential objective moral truth, let's say,
right?
If you believe that exists, but you may only be able to realize that up to a certain point based on the society you live in. So there might be a relativism based off of what your culture is willing to accept.
Right. And
if that makes sense.
I like that you say that moral relativism kind of exists on a spectrum. It's almost kind of like you're saying it's like there's more than one way to skin a cat, but maybe there's more than one way to build a building. Maybe there's more than one way to build an economic system that also achieves, even though it might be different in its process and how it gets to the end goal is kind of what we all ultimately agree upon. We all want to lead happy lives that, are meaningful, that give us a sense of responsibility, I would think, but at an individual level, but on a societal level, responsibility to other people as well.
Yeah.
All right.
But how do we get there? That's the question.
That's the question. Do you guys have any thoughts? Wolf, I think we did a pretty good job of trying to jam through this. It definitely felt like a jazz odyssey.
Yeah, I have to say my head has definitely been hurting the most of all the episodes we've been working on so far. There's so many confusing topics all wrapped together in this one.
Right. Well, I guess my closing thought would be, if I'm ever feeling that, if you're ever feeling that, it's probably a good idea to just take a break, take a nap, as Descartes would say, after I think about these things, I become quite tired and I must rest. So I think
I think it's time for us to rest then.
Perfect time to wrap up. Thank you, Olympians. Wolf,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you.